Is that all right? Yeah, all right. Lovely, lovely. Okay, so tonight's speaker probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Just happy to say that I've come across Alan's work in numerous forms and dimensions. At one point in life, when I had a bit of a liberty issue, I was lucky enough to be confined with a large pile of animals, comics, and Promethea, in fact, opened up a rather large portal for me into a kind of Kabbalistic dimension. So I'm very, very pleased to have the man here. Without further ado, I'll go and get him. Thank you very much.
Well, hello everybody, thank you very much for coming. I hope this won't be a tremendous disappointment, but I haven't done any preparation for the speech this evening, so I'm just hoping to rely upon my magical powers of spontaneous improvisation to kind of get me through. I thought that what I'd probably like to talk about was magic. It seems to be a safe, receptive environment to talk about that kind of thing. Sorry to sound cautious, but last week I went down to an event that was called The Amazing Meeting at the Hilton Hotel, and they sent a limo to pick us up from Northampton, and we hadn't had any real information about what was happening. And I got down there into the lobby, and it was packed, and I saw two people kind of heading towards me. I thought this probably is the reception committee. They'd come to welcome me to this, whatever it is that I've agreed to do. But it turned out that they were Alan Moore fans who were, they're really nice people, but I'd only just got out of the car into the lobby, and they were saying, "Oh, thank you so much for coming to this event." And then I thought, oh dear God, this is a convention. And about 5 minutes later I thought, and it's a skeptics convention. And given that I am probably mostly known for my snake worship, the thing that they're sceptical about is probably me. And it also said that they'd put me top of the bill. It was a bit uncomfortable. I've got nothing against Richard Dawkins, you know. He sat down next to me at one point, and I just pretended I hadn't noticed because I thought that the conversation would probably get embarrassing. But I got through it all right. I think I managed to have them eating out of the palm of my hand by the end of the event on rationalism, which I don't know how that happened, but it was a victory, you know. But tonight I feel that I can probably open up a little bit and just talk about what magic was like how I got into it, how it happened, what the experience was like, just personally. And I suppose you have to go back to when I was a child. I think that the first book that I got out of the local library was called The Magic Island, or The Magic Island, as I called it before I found out about the soft G. And I knew that I liked the concept of magic, and even as a kid I think I'd got a kind of an instinct that if something existed as a concept, then it sort of existed. It didn't exist physically, but it existed conceptually, and that was okay. I think this was my basic feeling. Later, when I grew up, I think that is what they call ontology. But I'm still not very certain with that word, so if it turns out I've got it completely wrong, then please forgive me. But it's something to do with the existence of ideas. I mean, Wittgenstein, I believe, again, it could have been Kierkegaard, I'm not really very good with philosophers, but one of those smart guys said, a thought is a real event in space and time. I'm not sure I entirely agree with him on the space and time bit, but we can kind of bond over the thought is a real event bit. I probably first started to become aware of magic as a serious concept at the age of about 12, when I briefly flirted with the world of Dennis Wheatley paperbacks, and like 12 is the only age when you can take Dennis Wheatley's book seriously. 13, you start to realise that he was a kind of anti-communist sort of fanatic who seemed to believe that Satan and Stalin were the same person. I mean, I can understand it's an easy mistake to make, but he'd built an entire philosophy out of this. And of course, yeah, I was fascinated by all this stuff about drawing pentacles and the goat of Mendes and all of these other things that, you know, were nice sort of window dressing for the mind of a 12-year-old boy. But as I got older, this was during the 60s, when there was a magical revival going on. Aleister Crowley was on the front of Sgt. Pepper, as was William Blake. I think that the Thoth Tarot deck by Crowley and Frieda Harris had just been released. There was a genuine interest in the occult. It was just part of that sort of psychedelic counterculture. And I got a certain amount of interest in it, but this was kind of overridden by the fact that I didn't feel that many of the people involved in it were as intellectually stringent as they perhaps should have been. Some of them seemed to me, and this was probably just prejudice, but they seemed to me to be people who were lacking something socially or perhaps emotionally, and who wanted to fill the hole with a belief in secret knowledge or secret power, which seemed a bit tragic or sad. I mean, I could appreciate that some of the things that they were interested in were possibly valid, but it was the need to believe that put me off. And this sort of carried on until probably I met the most influential figure in my life in many ways. This was the guy who taught me how to write comics, got me into magic, and is in many ways responsible for completely ruining my existence. This is Steve Moore, who, if he's ever mentioned in the press, it says Steve Moore, no relation. We're actually, I'm going to see if I can get this on his tombstone. Here lies Steve Moore, no relation, and then his dates. You know. But, I met Steve when I was about 14. He was somebody who'd been working in the British comics field since he was 16. He was a genius who'd taken his O-levels a year early and then had got confused by... He was actually in love with science fiction, but he confused that with a love of science and ended up working for Home Pride as like a flower grader when he was 16 and just thinking, how has this happened to me? And what he was really interested in was science fiction and comics, so he got a job working for Oddham's Press back in 1967. And I met Steve a couple of years later. He was sort of 19 and I was about 14. And we got on really well. And I kind of followed Steve's progress. Before I made any moves, I wanted to see whether it killed him or sent him mad. You know, I mean, it sounds a bit cold-hearted, but it's just being practical, you know. And Steve is a very strange individual. He, I think it was in 1976, when he'd become obsessed with Orientalism. He was watching loads of Hong Kong action flicks. And I mean, eventually he became a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society. I mean, he's serious about this. He got into the I Ching. And with his first paycheck from some new job, he went out and bought a Chinese coin sword. This is like 108 cash coins, which have got the little square holes in the middle, bound together with a red thread into the shape of a sword. And he just thought it was cool. He knew that these were used for exorcisms, and it was just the idea of owning a magic sword. So he bought it for probably about 10 quid, and he got it home that night, and of course you bought a magic sword, you want to play with it, you know, but he hadn't got any idea how to go about it. So he thought he'd improvise some kind of magical ritual that he'd just make up. So he did. He asked for guidance and a confirming dream and waved his sword about a bit and then thought, right, well that was it, I'm going to go to bed. So he went to bed. The next morning he woke up and on the edge of sleep heard this voice whisper in his ear, a male voice, whisper in his ear the word Endymion. And at first he thought, oh, that's just dream gibberish. It doesn't mean anything, it's just one of those words that you make up in dreams. Then he remembered that he'd heard it recently, or he'd come across it recently, in a book that he'd not particularly enjoyed, that was called The Erotic World of Fairy. It was talking about the erotic elements in a lot of old fairy stories. And it turned out that Endymion was the title of a poem by John Keats. It told the story, or retold the story, from Greek mythology of this shepherd boy called Endymion, who falls in love with the goddess of the moon, Selene, who is also the goddess of night and dreams. And she explains to him that the only way he can be with her always is to be in an eternal sleep, a kind of life in death, or death in life. And he says, yeah, that sounds pretty good to me. And that's pretty much the whole story. That's it. He lives with her on the moon in a dream. He's mentioned in Lucian, who was the Roman satirist who wrote a book called A True History, which is just like a pack of lies from beginning to end, including how a water spout picked him up and dunked him on the moon where he met Selene and Endymion and all the rest of it. That's pretty much the whole of the story, but Steve found something kind of resonant with that. And as time went on, he started to get like library angels. This is where you're looking for something, some fact, some piece of data, some piece of information, and books just fall off of library shelves, practically open at the page that you were looking for. It's a recognised phenomenon. So he started to get these little coincidences happening, and he started to have dreams about the moon goddess, things that seemed to relate, and he started to identify with the Endymion figure. And he, by this point, he'd painted a tiny miniature picture of the goddess, just this little nude figure, really tiny. I figure he'd made it small and nude because he knew that way he'd be able to keep up the enthusiasm to finish it. I think he knew himself too well, but it turns out this exquisite little picture. I'm sort of friends with Steve by this point, and I'm keeping an eye on him. I'm interested in this. It seems to be fairly unique. He's actually worshipping a goddess who only manifests in dreams, and seems to be building a relationship with that goddess. Sometimes to the point of having no real physical relationships in real life. There was an unrequited love that had been sort of hanging heavy upon his heart for a number of years, but mainly it was this focus upon Celine. And this was going on, and around about when I turned 40, I'd been interested in the occult for a number of years. And then, I don't know what it is, I just went out with my daughters and a load of my friends on my 40th birthday party. I drank quite a lot of Kronenberg, which we have on draft up in Northampton. And at the end of the evening, I thought, well, this is not much of a 40th birthday party, really. I haven't said anything completely mad and indefensible yet. But I suddenly said, listen, I've just decided I'm going to become a magician, and for the rest of my life, I shall be a magician, and even when I'm sober tomorrow, I really mean this. And so everybody said, oh yeah, cheers Alan, and packed me into a cab, got me home, but the next morning, I actually thought, oh God, what do I do now? Obviously, I can't look like an idiot, so I am just going to have to change the rest of my life and actually become a magician, even though I've not really got any clear idea as to whether such things exist or not. I suppose some of my thinking had sort of started to change around when I was working on the big Jack the Ripper book that I was doing, From Hell. I'd got this scene where my suggested culprit for Jack the Ripper, in a fiction, I mean I'm sure that in real life he didn't do it, but it was William Gull, Queen Victoria's surgeon in ordinary, who actually, I think, probably in real life did a lot of good for women. He was the first one to identify anorexia as a complaint. He identified a thyroid complaint in older women that could lead to kind of cretinism, but which only needed a little bit of iodine to correct. So probably he was a friend to women. Probably I was being a bit unfair by suggesting that he dissected 5 East End prostitutes in the autumn of 1888, but it was dramatic licence. And I've got this scene where I'd had William Gull and his coachman and stooge John Netley touring around London visiting various mystical sites. And I think I'd got them in somewhere in Earl's Court, which was the site of a well that was sacred to the sun god Belinus. And I had them eating a steak and kidney pie and discussing metaphysics over the steak and kidney. And William Gull says, he's talking about gods, and he says the one place that gods inarguably exist, Netley, is in the human mind, where they are real in all their grandeur and monstrosity. And I thought, yeah, that sounds good, that would do for a balloon, it's less than 25 words, works all right. And then I thought, actually that's true, isn't it? I can't think of a way around that statement. Of course, gods and demons and everything else, of course they're real in the human mind. And that is pretty much the only place where they actually need to exist. Alright, there may not be gods, but we have carpeted our battlefields in corpses, following the dictates of these possibly imaginary beings. They obviously have a lot of clout. Belief in them, whether they're there or not, has pretty much shaped our entire civilization. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to have to revise my life in order if only I hadn't written that particular word balloon, I wouldn't have been in anywhere near as much trouble. But once I'd written it, I could either deny it or do something about it. So this is what led to me making my drunken decision after several pints of Carlsberg to actually become a magician. The next morning, I've got no idea. Where do you start with something like that? I mean, it's not just enough to go out and buy a pointed hat or a robe with stars and moons on it. I mean, that's clearly not going to work. So I went and spoke to Steve Moore. I said, how do you go about this business, Steve? You know, you seem to have a fairly decent relationship with this Greek moon goddess. What would you suggest? And he said, well, finding a god is probably a good thing to do because, like, this terrain, the terrain of magic, is pretty much entirely imaginary. So if you're going to venture into it, you could do worse than have an imaginary friend to show you around. I mean, that seemed logical to me. I mean, yes, I had been doing psychedelic drugs since the age of 15, but it did seem logical to me that it might work like that. So I thought, all right, so who should I go for a god? And none of them really appealed to me. They all seemed a bit pompous and a bit slaughtery, you know. But Steve said, have you ever seen Alexander's serpent? And I've got no idea what he was talking about. I said, no. He got out this book of classical antiquities, and there on the front was this statue that had been found in a place called Tomis, which I believe is Costanza, which is currently, it's around the Balkan region, what used to be called Moesia Superior and Moesia Inferior. It's quite close to the Black Sea coast, and they'd broken open a tomb and they'd found this statue of this snake god, a gigantic constrictor with a semi-human head, long blonde hair, eyelids that are kind of closed so that they're perpetually sleepy, and it got ears, which snakes don't have, so eyelids, long blonde hair, ears, look very, very much like Paris Hilton. But it looked a lot more real. And probably nicer as a person, you know. And I thought, this is lovely. I thought, this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. It's comical, it's pretty, it's got my haircut, it's sort of, and it looks smug. And I like a bit of smugness in a god. I mean, if I was a god, I'd be smug all the time, you know. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to just accept this ridiculous-looking creature as my deity, because it would be kind of funny, and it also feels like it would perhaps be kind of profound. And I like a certain amount of humour in my mysticism, you know. So I thought, all right, I accept Glycon, who turned out, there was quite a story behind. Most of it came from Lucian the philosopher again, but this was actually true, because Lucian was rubbishing a rival philosopher who was called Alexander of Abanoticus. And Alexander, I mean, he's my man, you know. He started out as a rent boy around Alexandria, around the Black Sea coast. Then he got taken on under the wing of a travelling snake oil salesman who claimed to have been educated by Apollonius of Tyana. Then the travelling snake oil salesman, he teaches Alexander everything about herbalism, and then he dies and leaves his entire business to Alexander. And the more you follow this story through, loads of people team up with Alexander, then they die. And Alexander goes on to reap all the benefits of the situation. In this case, he kind of worked his way up until he'd been going through the town of Pella, which is where Alexander the Great, his namesake, had apparently come from. And according to the myth, Alexander the Great had resulted from the union of Alexander's mother, who was a human woman, and Zeus in the form of a python, or perhaps a python with a really ingenious kind of line in date rape pattern. You know, one or the other. So out of this union had come Alexander the Great. So pythons were really big in Pella. Everybody had got them. These huge tame constrictors. And Alexander thought, oh, this is a good plan. You know, sort of, I'm going to take one of these really, the biggest and sweetest constrictors, and I'm going to smuggle it into Abernethychus. And then I've got my mate who writes false prophecies. He's going to write all these rhyming couplets that will predict the birth of the new Asclepius in this town. And then he's going to die, like they all do, so that only Alexander knows about the false predictions. He put a blown goose egg with a tiny little live serpent inside it, in a puddle. Then he dressed up in a loincloth, he'd got long hair extensions, and he was faking an epileptic seizure. Probably, I don't know, a sherbet fountain sort of poured into the mouth, you know, because this was a sign of, epilepsy was a sign of being touched by the gods. It gave an element of class and sort of validation to your pronouncements. So he started thrashing around apparently possessed by divine beings. He goes to this temple of Asclepius, he bends down, reaches into the puddle of water, picks up this egg as if by magic, splits it open with his thumbnail, a live serpent crawls into his hand, and he says, "Behold, the new Asclepius." And everyone says, well, it's not very big, is it? And he says, well, I've got to take it home and let it grow. So he takes it home, where he's got the other boa constrictor hidden. And he keeps it there for about a week, just giving out sort of news of how it's developing, presumably like shouting through the letterbox, something like that. And he says, oh, it's coming on fantastic. It's about 6 foot tall, got a human head, long blonde hair. Oh, it's talking Greek. And meanwhile, he built this kind of strange headpiece, which had got a tongue that was controlled by horsehair. I figured that the droopy eyelids were because it would have been very difficult to make realistic eyes at that point. They wouldn't have been able to make kind of glass eyes, so it would have been obviously fake painted eyeballs or the lids. I figured that the hair was to cover up the joint between what Alexander had got. He'd got the snake's head under his armpit, and he'd got the speaking tube or whatever it was over his shoulder. So he announces, yes, my snake is ready, I'm going to display it in the temple, probably in a weak light, and who knows, there may have been some sort of sacrament, like in the mystery religions. So he gets this glove puppet with the serpent, and he's there, the theatre's packed, and Glycon speaks. He says, I am Glycon, scion of Jupiter and light of the world, and I don't want to go back in the gods. Then Alexander said, but you've got to go back in the gods. No, I don't want to go back in the gods. And it was terribly funny, but you had to be there. So this was the beginning of the Glycon cult, which was huge. It spread all the way across the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire. At one point, I think Marcus Aurelius, when he was emperor, he actually went to Glycon to ask for an oracle about what to do about the Teutons, who were sort of pressing in on the borders of Rome and across the Danube. And I think Glycon said, yeah, throw 2 lions into the Danube and there will be a great victory. So they threw 2 lions into the Danube, which swam across to the other side, got out. The Teutons had never seen them before, thought they were diseased and malformed dogs, and so killed them. And then at the battle, the Romans got completely hammered by the Teutons, and they said to Glycon, look, you said there'd be a great victory, and apparently Glycon fell back on the Delphic defence, which is, well, I didn't say the who. And, but Glycon, it lasted for about, the cult lasted for 150 years, which was quite a long time. That was after Alexander's death. And it was absurd. It was a glove puppet. I knew that. I knew that there had never been a snake with a semi-human, semi-Paris Hilton head that could speak Greek. I'm not an idiot, you know. That is as unlikely as, say, what, a virgin birth or physically ascending to heaven. You know, I wasn't interested in the physical nature of this. To me, a god is the idea of a god. I was starting to formulate the sort of concept that, yeah, gods exist in the mind. So what is the mind? Yes, we have our rational conception of what mind is, but that's kind of limited because science cannot actually... Science has done wonderful things. It has raised us up from the mud. It has made our human condition tolerable, or pretty near tolerable. But it can only talk about things that can be reproduced in a laboratory, empirically. So therefore it cannot talk about the human mind. I mean, like Bletchley, which is very near Northampton, that was where Alan Turing did a lot of his work during the war. And he came up with the Turing test, which is basically saying that we can never have any way of proving whether even another human being is conscious in the same way that we are. We can't prove that. He was extending it, so he was more or less saying, so how could we ever tell if a supposed thinking machine was conscious? We couldn't. So science can't really talk very much about the mind. And that seems like I'm dismissing the entire field of psychology and psychoanalysis. Yeah, I am. But no, I've got a lot of time for it, but it seems to me to be occultism in a lab coat. It seems to me to have nothing more solid to talk about than the concept, the concept of the unconscious. Jung didn't make that up. That was Paracelsus back in the 1400s. He was the first person to use the term unconscious. A lot of the ideas that Jung and Freud were circulating were very old ideas in the magical orders and the magical traditions that were around, like I say, from the 15th century up to the 19th century. So science can't really talk very usefully about the mind, which probably for most people that's not a big deal. But as a creative writer, this is how I pay my rent. And if you were, say, a car mechanic, if you drove cars for a living, you'd want to at least know, if the car suddenly stopped, what to do. You know, you lift up the bonnet and you fiddle around with some stuff and maybe it goes again. You need to at least know that. So if you're relying upon your mind to produce ideas every day, pretty much, new ideas, then you ought to know, well, how does that process work? Where do ideas come from? And I started to conceive of mind and consciousness as a kind of landscape. It struck me that maybe ideas were just landmarks in that landscape, that they just were somewhat located in it, and that landscape didn't necessarily have to be completely discrete. It wasn't necessarily that we all had our own mental landscape. It struck me that it was possible that just as we have our own physical address in the real world, the street outside that address is common to everybody. It struck me that there might be areas of the mind which were communal. That we have our personal mind space, but maybe that linked up to, I don't know, a Jungian unconscious, or something like that, collective unconscious, a kind of communal space. I thought, well, if that is so, it's a decent hypothesis, it should be testable. And also, if that is so, then what might the flora and fauna of such a space be? I mean, presumably you could encounter other wandering human minds in such a space, theoretically. What if there were entities that were native to that space? Creatures made entirely out of concepts. Is that possible? Don't know, but it seemed conceivable, and it seemed that that would explain almost all of the gods, demons, grey aliens, smurfs, and other creatures of the imagination that we have entertained since our species' inception. So this at least did give me a way that this might be possible. So I got my god, Glidecon. And I said, well, how do you go about worshipping a kind of 2nd century glove puppet snake thing? And Steve said, well, do an icon, make a graven image. That's always a good bet. It's got its own commandments telling you not to do it. So it must be effective in some way. It must be as good as like adultery or killing, So I decided that I was going to make an image, a collage image of the snake Glidecon. And I'm not sure whether I'd begun work upon this, but this coincided with me going down to Steve Moore's, well, I should be going later on tonight when I finished here, and we were just going to relax and perhaps take a few psilocybin mushrooms. This was early in the January of 1994, and yes, there'd been an unusually sort of lavish crop on the local racecourse. And yeah, we've been taking these things recreationally for years. So we weren't planning to do any magic. Indeed, we didn't know how to do any magic. We were just like taking drugs in a purely sort of decadent and relaxational way. We perhaps took rather a lot because I always have difficulties in actually judging dosages, but no more than we'd taken upon previous occasions. And we started talking about magic, not doing any magic, just talking about it. And we were starting to get increasingly befuddled, or at least I was. Steve was probably holding on to his marbles more successfully at that point. But he was saying, we were talking about the idea of coming up with some new form of magic. I was thinking maybe using the William Burroughs, Brian Dyson cut-up technique. And I can remember Steve saying, yeah, I suppose you could write a piece of purposive magic. You could write something that would sort of say what you wanted to get out of the magic. Then you could write a piece of text that was like represented the god. then you could cut them both together, and that in some way would combine the purpose with the concept of the deity. And I couldn't tell what he was talking about. I was only getting about half of this, and I said, right, so what you're saying is we get a piece of text representing the god and another piece of text representing the goddess, and then we cut them together, and that would be like a hermaphrodite. It would be this ultimate fusion of the alchemical male and female prince. This is fantastic. And he said, yeah, but that's not actually what I'm saying. What I'm talking about is getting a text to represent the purpose of the piece of magic, a spell if you like, text to represent the god, we cut them together. And I said, yeah, that's fantastic. So that would be like taking the female, a text representing the female deity, and we cut them together. This is fantastic, man, this is like alchemy. And he was saying, yeah, but that's not actually what I'm saying. And then eventually, after we'd gone through this another time or two, I was just going into my, oh yeah, because we could cut the female and the male together. And he said, Alan, we've been through this 3 times. At which point, everything went strange. It was suddenly, the realisation that we'd been in some kind of loop, conversationally, and then it all started to, it was an unprecedented experience. It's difficult to actually describe in material terms. The sensation that I had was that the roof had gone. There wasn't sky up above, there was some sort of higher space. I got the impression of something bending over and leaning down, as if to get its head closer to us. And I remember I suddenly spoke in this really strange Darth Vader voice that I don't think I can do now. But it just came out, and the words were, in Coate's presence, stooping low. And much deeper than that. I am your father. I didn't even know what the word inchoate meant. I've since found that it means on the brink of form. And there seemed to be something in this, that whatever it was that was leaning towards us was gathering form as it got closer to us. It was dressing itself in imagery that we were supplying. I'm not saying it was the god Glykon, but by the time it was in proximity to me, it was the god Glykon. Me and Steve were both taken upon this ridiculous journey. Nothing like this had ever happened to us before. And also, we were both hallucinating, obviously, but we were having the same hallucinations at the same time. I remember one moment where I suddenly realised that all of these incredible things that had happened had only happened in my head, that I'd in fact gone mad, that Steve had probably phoned the ambulance already, and I was looking at him and his eyes were so worried, and I realised, oh my God, he's worrying about me. All of this stuff's just been happening in my head. We haven't contacted gods, we're not doing magic, I've just gone insane. Look at all the worry in his eyes. And I said, Steve, all of that stuff, has that actually happened? And he burst out laughing and said, I was just thinking, have I gone mad? Oh God, look, Alan looks so worried. It went on and on. There was a moment where we were in this white space full of dead magicians. William Blake, figures that we didn't recognise, John Dee, Edward Kelly, and at the back of the assembly, tall things with animal heads. it did. We apologised for bursting in on them because we couldn't actually stop giggling at this point. I mean, animal heads, it was ridiculous, you know. And so we just sort of said, look, we're terribly sorry to have broken in upon your meeting like this. We're just idiots. We'll leave. But we were both experiencing the same thing. We had a moment when we realised that we were outside time, and that in fact time was not how we perceived it. That it's a kind of fourth dimensional hole, and time isn't really passing. Which I think is in accordance with what Einstein and Stephen Hawking and most people since Einstein seem to think, that that is the case. We are in a fourth dimensional universe in which time is only passing to us. And I remember sort of looking at Stephen and said, that means that nobody ever dies. That means that sort of no moment is ever lost. It is all suspended there in this stupefyingly huge, giant jewel of unchanging space-time, where time is an optical illusion. And death becomes a perspective illusion of the third dimension. This was very heartening, you know. The next morning, when we both went off to our separate beds and going off to sleep, the next morning when we compared notes, we both had the same eidetic imagery scrolling down inside our eyelids, somewhere between like Egyptian steles or sort of printed circuits. And we felt that this was an initiatory experience. We didn't know quite what to do with it. But I started to think, so what should I do with magic? I didn't really like, I was reading some of the stuff by the chaos magicians who were around at that time. And it was very glamorous, kind of like, yeah, magic with a nose ring, basically. I mean, so that's perhaps a bit dismissive. But I didn't like the fact that it was results-based magic. They were saying, look, this form of magic, it gets results. You can do a sigil, like Austin Osman Spare did, and that'll get you anything you want. Yet if that was true, why are you still working at Dixon's? You know, it's sort of, it's why aren't you happy? You know, if that's really true. Yes, I've got no doubt that it worked for Austin Spare, but Austin Spare was a wonderful artist, a wonderful magician, and a wonderful human being. Maybe it does work, but why use it? I mean, the more I looked at it, it seemed that people who were using sigil magic, because it always works, would generally be trying to get some partner to fall in love with them, or they would be trying to punish somebody that they felt had slighted them, or they would be trying to get some money, generally. Almost all of the great magicians, including Dr. John Dee, Aleister Crowley, all of them, apart from Austin Osman Spare, but all the rest were not above. I mean, Dr. Dee, he wasn't above tapping up the angels for a fiver now and again. You know, they all asked for money, and there's something wrong with that. I mean, like, it seems to me that if you want more money, then why don't you kind of magically get off of your magical arse and magically do some work and see if some of the magic money doesn't magically turn up in your magic bank account. You know, if you want someone to love you, don't use supernatural entities to make them love you, because that compares unfavourably with simple rape, where at least you're not getting the spirits to hold them down for you. You know? And anyway, wouldn't it be better to sort of try and work upon improving yourself and making yourself someone that is worthy of love, you know. The same with if you've got a grudge against somebody. Rather than bringing a demonic curse down upon their head, why don't you just, I don't know, pay a couple of hired goons called Vinny and Nails or something like that, you know, or possibly just kind of get over it and move on, like a grown-up would. You know, the thing is, if it's something that can be accomplished by ordinary human beings, don't bother magic with it. Because all of these entities, if they indeed exist, have presumably got more important things than sorting out your overdraft. You know, it's... So, the signal that I was kind of getting was that whatever it was that I'd blundered into, what it wanted from me was artwork. It wanted some kind of performance that would express the ideas that were kind of crashing in on me around this period. And for about 6 months I was on another planet. I was still functioning, but I'd got a sort of a strange faraway look in my eye. And I was entertaining some very strange ideas, you know. Not all of them completely valid. But I actually kind of got through this and thought, yeah, what is needed is some sort of performance. I bet that I'm the first magician ever to have had this idea because I'm so brilliant. Then I found out that no, they've all had that idea. It just seems to be the idea that comes to you after you commence magic. John Dee did magical performances. In fact, he got into real trouble by having a flying beetle at this performance of it was one of the Greek playwrights, I've forgotten which one, Aeschylus or someone like that. John Dee had arranged this flying beetle, obviously with wires or mirrors or something like that, but that was what got him his reputation for black magic and diabolism. It wasn't any of the actual talking to entities. It was a little bit of stagecraft with a flying beetle. But Samuel McGregor Mather, who was one of the guys who kicked off the Golden Dawn, he was doing elaborate theatrical performances. Crowley did a lot of them. And then I found out that the whole idea of opera was apparently conceived by Giuseppe Verdi, who was an alchemist, and who believed that he could come up with a new form of art that would include all of the other forms of art. There would be writing, there would be beautifully painted backdrops, there would be costumes, there would be singing, there would be drama, all of these things combined into one form, which would get across the ideas of alchemy. This is why a lot of the early operas are based upon alchemical themes, like The Ring, or sort of The Magic Flute. A lot of them are based upon alchemical ideas. And so, yes, we started to do these performance pieces that we didn't know what we were doing. We've got no idea at all. We were just guided by voices, I think. And so we started to sort of work with this material. And it did seem to be the most natural thing, and it also kind of underlined the connection that there is between magic and art. That, to my way of thinking, they're practically the same thing. That if you've got a magician with an empty top hat who pulls out a rabbit, or you've got an artist with an empty mind who pulls out an idea, it's the same principle. It's something from nothing. And also, I've kind of got sick of going to comic conventions and having people say, Mr. Moore, where do you get your ideas from? Because, not that that's a stupid question, it's a really good question, it's just that we can't answer it. Artists and writers don't know where they get their ideas from. That's why we look so anxious all the time. And that this could stop at any moment. Halfway through the mortgage repayments, then where would we be? But to me, it seemed that magic was about creativity, It was about where we get our ideas from. And it seemed to me to be a way of extending my abilities as a writer and an artist. I felt that I'd kind of got to the end of what I could accomplish just with rationality. I felt that if I was going to get into the area of my heroes, people like William Blake, then you needed to take a step beyond the edge of rationality. I can remember back when I started my magical experiments, I said to my friends and loved ones, look, if it appears that I'm going mad, can you kind of like pull me out, get me to a doctor, something like that. And they said, yeah, so how will we know if you've gone mad? And I said, yeah, good point. Well, what about if, as long as I'm happy? And then I thought, no, you could be drawing on the wall in your own excrement and be completely happy. That's not really a good sort of standard to judge it by. I thought, if I'm functional, that works. If I'm functional, if I'm still producing as much work as I used to, and if it's still as good, then there's probably nothing wrong with me. And as it turned out, I was producing more work than I'd previously been capable of, and it was all pretty good. To my mind, some of it was better than the material that I'd done previously. So it seemed to be working, and I've carried on this kind of hybrid career of kind of magician, writer, actress, model, whatever. Yeah. And I mean, funnily enough, yes, I better tie all this together and turn it into a plug for a commercially available project. About 3 or 4 years ago, I got my mate Ian Sinclair, who is, to my mind, possibly the greatest writer in the English language at present. He wanted me to contribute to this book called London City of Disappearances, which was, the brief was, it has to be about someone or somewhere or something that has disappeared, is disappearing, or will disappear somewhere in London. And the first person I thought of was Steve Moore. I mean, he's no more disappearing than any of us are, but when he does disappear, it will be a more unusual character than many of us. I mean, this is somebody who has lived in the same house all of his life, up there on the top of Shooters Hill, who currently sleeps about 6 paces away from the spot where he was born. That is not a common story these days. I mean, even my grandmother moved twice in the course of her life, you know. So I decided I was going to write about Steve's life, about the Endymion dream, about the growing relationship with the moon goddess, and how all of this had played out, because it had come to quite an interesting conclusion. Basically, Steve was pining over his unrequited love, but he had met a woman over the internet, and she was from Brazil. Her dad owned his own coffee plantation, and like there was the beach hut in Bahia, and sort of, I mean, this is in Brazil, and she's beautiful. She is an instructress of a tantric form of yoga, which includes sexual yoga. She wants him to go and visit her at the beach house in Bahia, or perhaps on her dad's coffee plantation. He thinks that he's been given the wrong script. This is just nothing that ever happens to Steve. And he goes out there, he has a relationship. It's kind of great. It carries on mostly by email. She comes out to visit England, and she doesn't really like South London. You know, it's the view out of Steve's back bedroom window, which is spectacular. It's a north-facing window, so you can see the whole of London just spread out. At night, it looks like fairyland. You can't see any of the stabbings or anything else going on, it's just lights. But to her, it lacked mountains and coastline and jungle and couldn't really be called a view. And so she went back, and Steve was thinking maybe this relationship's not going to be going on for much longer. But his initial unrequited love had just had a divorce. Yay! And she was, as you do, she was pinned under the rubble of the divorce. And she was calling out for help, like you do. And she wanted to feel attractive, as you do, in the wake of something like that. And perhaps a couple of times in her late night conversations with Steve, she'd had a couple of glasses too much wine. She gave out the wrong signals, maybe. Anybody would have understood what was happening. Anybody except Steve, really. He thought, yes, this is destiny. We're gonna finally get together. It's going to be great. Then he gets a sort of message from his love in Brazil saying that the relationship's off. And that hurts, but there's this possibility that this other relationship might be on. He's starting to get a bit strange. He's he's working upon this book called Somnium. And fiction, it's a tricky thing. Even if you're not involved in magic, fiction will send you mad. What Steve starts to do is to write this book called Somnium, which is about a 19th century writer who, in the wake of a doomed affair, has gone to live in the Bull Hotel right at the top of Shooters Hill, where he's writing a book about an Elizabethan character who, and the book is also called Somnium. The Elizabethan character has come to Shooters Hill and found himself in this kind of erotic dream world that is ruled over by Diana Regina, the goddess of the moon. So you've got a book within a book, and meanwhile the real author of Somnium is drinking more and listening to Elizabethan madrigals and gavottes and pavans, knocking back the scotch and putting on, that's what I call harpsichords, this elaborate, multi-layered story, and it's asking for trouble. You can just see it. This narrative is like so self-referential that it's like a whirlpool, and his central character is drinking and slowly losing his mind as he writes his book Somnium, and you can see where this is going, Then, with perfect timing, he gets a phone call from his previously unrequited love that he thought he might have a chance with since the divorce, where she asks him to share her joy at having found a new boyfriend. Yeah. So it all falls to bits. He wants to die. He's in real pain. And at this point, his elder brother, Chris, who was he was a cactus fancier, an expert on asclepiads and cacti, who was constantly going off to other countries, to cactus conventions. He announces he's going to be in Africa for the whole of September. So Steve thinks, right, if I'm going to go mad, I'm going to do it properly. I'm going to undertake an abramelin ritual, which is where it's very dangerous apparently, you withdraw from society for, I think, it's supposed to be about a year. You don't see anybody else. You don't have any contact with newspapers or anything. You constantly just read these books about magic, and you're working your way up to some kind of apocalyptic event where you encounter your guardian angel or highest part of yourself. Crowley tried it, and apparently ended up with spirits swarming all over the terraces at Boleskine Abbey. Never tried it myself. Prized my own sanity perhaps a little too much for that. But Steve, he goes into his retreat there in his house on the top of the hill. He's doing basically the same kind of tantric sex techniques that he did with his physical lover in Brazil, where you move the energy down through her chakras, up through your chakras, and you're cycling it. And he knows it's mad, but he does it with the goddess sitting astride his lap. And it feels the same. It feels the same as when there was a human being. He knows this is insane. But he's materialising. He's reading about Tibetan magic, and particularly the creation of tulpas, which are thought forms that are imagined with such ferocity that, according to descriptions, other people can see them as well, other people can touch them. He's trying to materialise the moon goddess. If he goes out down to the shops to get some papers or whatever, she goes with him. This naked moon goddess with a moon crown, walking between the sedate hedgerows of Shooter's Hill, only visible to him. If he looks away and looks back, she's still there. She's becoming more and more solid. And he starts to feel that maybe that's because if his dream woman is becoming more real, that seems to be at the expense of reality itself, which is becoming more surreal. While his brother's away in Africa, he gets a phone call from the head of the acting head of the Cactus Fancies Association, saying, "Oh, when's Chris coming back? Because the treasurer has gone mad and murdered his mother." And you know, that's Agatha Christie, isn't it? The head of the treasurer of the Cactus Fancies Association, and you know, blood on the antimacassar. You know, it's and also, I mean, this was what, 2001, September 2001. So Steve's keeping his journal, and on Tuesday the 11th, he makes a note just saying that apparently some people have flown planes into a couple of buildings in New York. It just goes to show that even an apparently solid consensual reality can flip over and change into something else just as easily as the content of a dream. That is his little note for September the 11th. Eventually Chris comes home. Steve, by this time, has got a fully materialised moon goddess living with him in the back bedroom. But he's not an idiot. He knows about Occam's razor. He knows about how the simplest explanation for all this is that he is a lonely old man who lives on top of Shooter's Hill and has lost his love, his way, his mind. That is the most logical explanation. So that puts him in a dilemma, you know, how to progress with this. Is it a tulpa? Or is it a brain tumour? Which? And the only way you can really sort it out is if somebody else can see her as well. You know, so at this point, he suggests coming up to Northampton, bringing her with him, and we'll see whether I can actually see her as well. I got some mushrooms in because I thought that might be useful. So he sits down on my sofa, and he takes his glasses off, and he folds his hands in his lap, and he asks me if I'm ready, and I say yes, not knowing at all what I'm letting myself in for. I say yes, and he closes his eyes. And I could see her. She was blue. She didn't look anything like the way he saw her. She didn't look anything like the picture of her that he'd done. She looked a lot younger. She looked about 13. She looked Turkish. She had long black hair. She didn't have the moon crown. What she had was a headband with a single peacock feather that rose to a crescent at the top. She was sitting on his lap. His real hands were still folded. He had two phantom hands up that were around the small of her back. Her arms were around his shoulders. She had her head resting upon his right shoulder. And she was turning her head back to look at me. These fantastic eyes. I was just sitting there riveted. She was blue. She was like electric blue on the highlights and see-through in the shadowed areas. And she kept trying to look back over her shoulder at me. And I was sitting there riveted and in a state of some shock. I hadn't expected it to work. I mean, Steve is my greatest friend. I have got nothing but admiration and respect. But I kind of thought that this was probably a hallucination as well, up until that point. Well, yes, it's a hallucination, but it was one that I could see as well, which makes it a different class of hallucination. At this point, I'm staring into these incredible eyes as she turns round and looks back at me over her shoulder. At this point, Steve suddenly shifts. She breaks up into a kind of talcum of blue light and dissipates. I'm babbling. You know, I'm saying, that was awesome. That was incredible. I could see her. She looked like this, and as she'd got her head upon your right shoulder, you'd got your hands up around her back, she'd got her arms up, and he said, yeah, that's exactly how we were sitting, but she won't keep still. She wants to look over her shoulder at you. She's asking me if she can just sit beside me on the couch so that she can see you properly. And yeah, she'd had her head on the same shoulder. She'd been doing the same thing in his mind as she was doing in mine. That's enough for me. You know, if it was a flesh and blood person, you don't treat people as if they're not real, because that's just rude. You know? So if this is a goddess, whatever that is, don't be rude. Treat her like she's real. So we just carried on with the rest of the evening. There was Steve and the goddess sitting there on my sofa. We had a kind of a dialogue or a trialogue. She was very funny. She'd occasionally make interjections into our conversation, which were kind of profound, surprisingly foul-mouthed at times, but very funny. And then they went off to bed. The next day, he took her back to London, travelling craftily on a single ticket. And I wrote this story called Unearthing, which got picked up. It's been turned into it'll be out as a book next year with lavish photo work in it by the photographer Mitch Jenkins. Lex Records have just brought it out as this real posh box set with 3 vinyl albums in it, and 2 or 3 CDs and photographs and a printout of the original story. And the sleeve of the record is a large reproduction of Steve's little postcard-sized naked picture of Selene, which was once just very personal, very private, and entirely for him. And we did a performance of the thing down in the tunnels under Waterloo a couple of months back, which was great. It's a lovely space. It really smells like a tunnel. I haven't really cleaned it up at all. It's just sort of dank and subterranean with trains rumbling by over your head. And they've got projections of Steve's house, Steve's goddess, and he was sitting there in the audience, unobserved because nobody knew who he was, but just looking at these things that had once been a private part of his life and his imagination, suddenly real and covering an enormous wall in front of an audience of people. This is in a way a kind of culmination of the process that he began having his dream back then in 1976. And back then it was just a dream, it was just a word heard in a dream. And now it's this huge multimedia presentation. Lots of people all over the world have seen his picture of Cellini and have heard the story. So, who knows? It seems to us as if we're just basically following instructions. None of this seems willed. We didn't decide to make it into a book and a record and all the rest of it, that just happened. We assume that this is being managed by the goddess herself, and we just kind of are prepared to delegate upwards and just sit back and keep out of the way and let the process work itself out. I suspect that this is how it has always happened. I mean, this sounds a bit postmodern as a sort of a reaction to magic, but I suspect it's always been something like this. And I suspect that generally it is one person coming to terms with the universe in their own way, which is to me at the heart of magic. I mean, I've got nothing against religion, except that religion is based upon, it's got, I think the root word is religare, which has the same root as ligature and ligament. It means bound together in one belief, which I don't think is natural. I mean, it's not even a spiritual belief. Marxism is a religion by that definition. Darwinism is a religion by that definition. And I find something unnatural about being bound together in anything. We don't look the same. We don't have the same emotional indices. We don't have the same intellectual range. We're completely different. Why should our spirituality be off the peg? You know, don't we deserve bespoke spirituality, where we just make it up ourselves as we go along? You know, this to me is what the magical experience is all about. It's establishing your own relationship with the universe, and one that you're comfortable with, and then seeing where it goes from there. Anyway, I've no idea, I've probably well overrun my time. Have we got time for questions and answers?
Time for just a few questions.
Okay, yeah, so...
Feel those? Anybody got any questions, maybe?
Can I just ask you quickly, if you'd taken those mushrooms that first time you saw the goddess? Or were you...
Oh yeah, no, I'd taken the mushrooms, and on a lot of subsequent occasions where I've encountered entities, but not all the time.
Not all the time. No, but that time you had.
That time I had. I remember the only thing that I've actually seen without the aid of psychedelic drugs was one of the Enochian spirits. We just thought we'd have a look at John Dee's Enochian system and see what it was like, which entailed me sitting there with Steve sat there with the crystal ball, while we worked out our own Enochian chant. We just made it up with an Enochian dictionary and then translated it all into phonetics, because we were just too lazy to go through the whole system the way that you're supposed to. We'd only got an afternoon, you know. So we just made up this incantation that was just asking something that was sufficiently elevated to have a word with us, if it felt like it. You know, not put itself about or anything, but just if it was available, nothing else going on. So Steve, I read the chanting, Steve looked in the ball, nothing really happened. He saw a couple of things that he found a bit disturbing, and so he didn't encourage any sort of contact with whatever it was that he was seeing. Then we changed over, so Steve was doing the chanting, and I was looking in the ball, and I was staring at it, and yeah, it was a quartz crystal ball. So all you could see was the flaws in the glass, which make it look kind of cloudy. And I thought, well, I suppose I could pretend that I was seeing a sort of a field of clouds. I could use my imagination and pretend that there was like a chariot sort of coming towards me across the clouds with a kind of young man in it in a sort of violet tunic with a headband. But that's just me imposing a picture. And all right, I suppose that now I could be imposing a picture of the same young man, but he seems to be on a grassy terrace with a balustrade behind him, and he's just standing there looking at me. And I suddenly thought, well, how else are you supposed to see anything if not with your imagination? How did I think this worked? Did I think there was a kind of cathode ray tube in here somewhere or sort of? So I thought, well, perhaps if I talk to him, then we'll see what happens. So I said, is there any symbol by which you are known? At which point his arm suddenly stopped being a watery violet and became outlined in red. And he just did this shape in the air, which, when we checked later, turns out to be an Enochian letter I, but drawn backwards, which I believe is how the angels, or whatever they were, first transmitted to Dr. D. So then I said, okay, I drew the symbol down. I said, is there any element that you are associated with? Then it became a kind of CGI special effect, a bit like, have you ever seen The Abyss? Not a very good film. It's got these water monsters in it that are just made out of moving water. It just, the male figure suddenly was made out of water. So I thought, all right, well, that's pretty fair. I can work that out. That's water. So then I said, is there a number that is associated with you? At which point its hand again went red, and in fire it drew the number 77. And then it went, turned round and walked away and vanished. And I thought, I've just been dismissed. So we looked up 77 in Crowley's, I think it was 77, in Crowley's Sefer Sephiroth, where he gives the meanings of all the various numbers. And 77 is apparently related to the second highest sphere of the Kabbalah, Chokmah. It's also related to the high priestess path, which runs straight to the highest sphere of the Kabbalah, Keter. And Crowley's notes say, so, this is of the very highest level of auspiciousness, but is of absolutely no use to the novice. And I thought, oh, I get it, yeah, sort of, yes, you have contacted something incredibly intelligent, but unfortunately you're too stupid to bother with, so come back when you've got some genuine information. Which we never did, but I liked that, and that was the only time when I'd been doing it without any psychedelic drugs. So, any other questions?
I've just got a quick note there, and actually, when I was sat there and you were talking about this kind of the stelae coming down, you were talking about the mushroom and glycos. I was looking at that painting and I was like, oh, there's a mushroom in there and there's a snake in there and there's all this kind of information coming down. It's like, that's very strange, isn't it?
Well, that'll happen.
Just that, there you go. Maybe it was my imagination.
Alan, I've never met you before. Thank you very much for your openness and your imagination and your presence. And you may not realise it, but you're standing next to something rather unusual. And I couldn't help but notice as you were talking. And I want to just report in something that was happening to me. Mm-hmm. Is that as you've been talking about magic, for about 30% of the time, I've been doing something that I've never done before. And that is I've been thinking of a McDonald's hamburger. This has never happened to me before, and it bothered me, and I couldn't understand why it was happening. And the only conclusion I can come to is that I've been trying to hang on to consensus reality while you've been talking, so that I've got a safe point that I know is real, and that is the McDonald's hamburger, which I hardly ever eat, maybe once a year.
You're loving it.
Yeah. And so I want to thank you for that experience. And I want to ask you this little question. Something happened to me recently which I consider to be completely ordinary, except it also never happened to me before. A woman came to me in my dreams. She was a great friend of my mum's. And my mum has died some years ago, and this woman said to me, her name's Henny, she said, "Irving, where have you been? You haven't been to visit me lately." And the next morning she was dead. And the email came and her funeral was that afternoon. And people thought this was extraordinary. And I thought it was very ordinary, even though it had never happened to me before. Is that magic in your parlance?
Well, I think that is, I'd agree with you that it is something which is in a way ordinary, even though it's completely outside what a rational worldview would allow. Sorry?
Bats do have this thing, don't they, where you can prove that a bat is a party to another bat's information.
I haven't actually read that. That might be, well,
It is extraordinary. There's not more fuss made out about it. That you can demonstrate that bats have a kind of common pool of information they're all reporting to, and they can all draw from.
Yeah.
So it's an actual real.
Well, I think this sounds like Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic.
Yeah, I've checked that. You see, I'm very, very Sheldrake cynical. So I've made sure that this is completely and utterly clear of any kind of Sheldrake taint.
Okay.
This is the real thing. You've got to check out the bats, Mr. Moore.
Well, I can well believe it. I mean, so they do. I mean, there's the point which Sheldrake, which I've got nothing against Rupert Sheldrake.
I do. I think he manipulates statistics and.
Well, you might well have done, but I did like that story, which, as far as I know, is true about the blue tits and the milk bottles, blue tits. When we first introduced milk bottles which had foil caps, this was before the Second World War, blue tits for a while just left them alone for decades, and then one day somebody reported that a blue tit had pecked its way through the foil cap and drunk the cream. Then this started happening all over Britain.
It spread like wildfire.
It spread like wildfire, and then we had a war when all of the aluminium that would have made milk bottle caps was being used to make shells. So they had cardboard boxes for the milk. And sort of, when the war finished, by which time 2 or 3 generations of blue tits had been born and died, the first morning that the milk bottles came back, the blue tits were there, pecking through the top, drinking the milk. I mean, with response to what you were saying about the visitation on the edge of death, yes, there could be a communality between all of us. I've had dreams of dead people where they seemed to know they were dead, where they passed on messages to the living. I don't know how that works. I mean, my current thinking is that I'm writing a huge novel called Jerusalem, which is based upon the idea that I mentioned earlier, that we're living in a 4th dimensional universe and that death is in a certain sense an optical illusion, that no one's going anywhere, there's nowhere for us to go, that every second that has ever existed exists somewhere in the 4th dimensional confines of space-time. And there's a lovely little story from Albert Einstein. This was only a couple of months before Einstein died himself, and he was consoling the widow of a fellow physicist. And he said, and I think this is beautiful, I found this out halfway through writing this book, Jerusalem, and it's such a perfect validation of my ideas. Einstein said, well, to a believing physicist like me, he said, death isn't really a big deal. He said, because I understand the persistent illusion of transience. And I think that's lovely, the persistent illusion of transience. We think people are dying, we think houses are being pulled down, we think golden ages are passing, we think that everything's vanishing and that yesterday is not there anymore. From what I understand of physics, that's not the case. And I tend to believe that at the end of our life, I read about a kind of near-death experience. I mean, everyone's familiar with the kind where you're looking up a tunnel of light and there's Jesus and your gran at the top end. This is fairly recent. I mean, all right, there's references in some of the pictures of Hieronymus Bosch, possibly to a similar phenomenon, but you didn't hear about it much until fairly recently. However, my mum was familiar with another form of near-death experience, which she told me about frequently. This was, they say that when you drown, when you go down for the third time, I'm doing a Northampton accent now, then your whole life flashes before your eyes. And I always think, what's that like when your whole life flashes before your eyes? You know, is it like a Max Sennett comedy where it's all speeded up, you know, and sort of diddling, diddling, diddling. But apparently no, what it is sort of, you see like an array of tiles, and each tile has a moment in it. This was reported by somebody who'd had it happen to him, went round and asked other people who he'd heard about what it was like. You see all the moments of your life spread out in a display. And all at the same time, it's not necessarily the bad moments or the good moments, your good deeds or your bad deeds. The overwhelming thing is a sense of responsibility. These are things that I have done. And to me, that sounds like all the moments of your life spread out in a single page. That sounds like a big sign saying, you are now leaving the third dimension, please drive carefully. So I think that at the end of life, we've got nowhere to go but back to the beginning. And that possibly we just have our lives over and over and over and over again. I can see some people shuddering at the very thought of that. But it'll be kind of fair, wouldn't it? You'd have all the hell or all the heaven that any fundamentalist preacher could ever ask for. The best moments of your life forever. I mean, that's heaven. The worst moments of your life forever, that is unending purgatory. So sort of, that is basically my feelings about it. I think that everything is eternal. And presumably we'll be having this conversation in another sort of 70 years or so, when we're all back here, you know. So anyway, I think I'll take it that my ride is there. But anyway, you've been a fantastic audience.